Prince William and Kate were having breakfast with their son George at Kensington Palace. It was a sunny Tuesday morning in London. George was eating his cereal while his parents talked about their plans for the day. William had a meeting with his charity team. Kate was going to visit a children's hospital. They would take George to school first. "I want to wear my blue tie today," said George. He was 7 years old now and very particular about his school uniform. Kate smiled and nodded. "Of course, the blue one is on your dresser." The royal family finished their breakfast. Their staff moved around the palace getting things ready for the day. Cars were being prepared. Schedules were being checked. The royal life was always busy. George went to his room to get ready for school. His nanny, Mrs. Thompson, helped him with his uniform. The palace was large, and George's room was in the family wing. It had big windows that looked out on the palace gardens. "Did you pack your homework?" Mrs. Thompson asked. George nodded. "Yes, I did my math last night with Daddy." William was a hands-on father. He always tried to help George with his schoolwork when he could. Even with his royal duties, he made time for his son. When George was dressed, he walked down the long hallway to the main entrance. The walls were lined with paintings of old kings and queens. George knew many of their names. William had taught him about his royal ancestors. At the entrance, William and Kate were waiting. They all got into the royal car. The drive to George's school took about 15 minutes. They talked about what George would do at school that day. "We have our class today," George said. "I want to paint a picture of our garden." Kate smiled. "That sounds lovely. I can't wait to see it." The car pulled up to the school. Unlike most children, George had security with him. 2 royal guards walked with the family to the school entrance. Other parents and children looked at them with interest. They were used to seeing the royal family, but it was still exciting. George's teacher, Miss Parker, greeted them at the door. "Good morning, Your Royal Highnesses." "Good morning, George." "Good morning, Miss Parker," they replied. William and Kate hugged George goodbye. "We'll pick you up at 3, Kate said. They watched as George walked into his classroom. Then they got back in the car. The royal couple had a full day ahead. Later that afternoon, William and Kate arrived to pick up George. He came running out with a painting in his hand. It showed the palace gardens, but there was something strange about it. "Look what I made," George said proudly. William took the painting. "This is very good, George. But who is this?" He pointed to a figure in the corner of the painting. It was an old man with a beard wearing what looked like a crown. George looked confused. "That's the man who walks in our garden sometimes. Don't you see him?" Kate and William exchanged looks. "What man, darling?" Kate asked gently. "The old man with the shiny crown. He waves to me from outside my window sometimes. He's very nice." William felt a chill run down his back. "George, there is no man with a crown in our garden." "Yes, there is," George insisted. "I see him all the time. He told me his name is George too." The ride back to the palace was quiet. William and Kate were worried. Who was this person George thought he saw? Was it just a child's imagination? Or was something strange happening? When they arrived home, George ran to his room to put away his school things. William turned to Kate. "We need to talk to security," he said in a low voice. "I want to make sure no one unauthorized is getting into the palace grounds." Kate nodded, but she looked thoughtful. "Do you think it could be something else?" The way he described the man with the crown. William didn't finish her thought. They both knew the royal family had many stories about the past. Some people said old palaces kept memories of those who lived there before. That night, they decided to watch George more carefully. Neither of them could have guessed what would happen next. Prince William and Kate were having breakfast with their son George at Kensington Palace. It was a sunny Tuesday morning in London. George was eating his cereal while his parents talked about their plans for the day. William had a meeting with his charity team. Kate was going to visit a children's hospital. They would take George to school first. "I want to wear my blue tie today," said George. He was 7 years old now and very particular about his school uniform. Kate smiled and nodded. "Of course. The blue one is on your dresser." The royal family finished their breakfast. Their staff moved around the palace getting things ready for the day. Cars were being prepared. Schedules were being checked. The royal life was always busy. George went to his room to get ready for school. His nanny, Mrs. Thompson, helped him with his uniform. The palace was large, and George's room was in the family wing. It had big windows that looked out on the palace gardens. "Did you pack your homework?" Mrs. Thompson asked. George nodded. "Yes, I did my math last night with Daddy." William was a hands-on father. He always tried to help George with his schoolwork when he could. Even with his royal duties, he made time for his son. When George was dressed, he walked down the long hallway to the main entrance. The walls were lined with paintings of old kings and queens. George knew many of their names. William had taught him about his royal ancestors. At the entrance, William and Kate were waiting. They all got into the royal car. The drive to George's school took about 15 minutes. They talked about what George would do at school that day. "We have art class today," George said. "I want to paint a picture of our garden." Kate smiled. "That sounds lovely. I can't wait to see it." The car pulled up to the school. Unlike most children, George had security with him. 2 royal guards walked with the family to the school entrance. Other parents and children looked at them with interest. They were used to seeing the royal family, but it was still exciting. George's teacher, Miss Parker, greeted them at the door. "Good morning, Your Royal Highnesses." "Good morning, George." "Good morning, Miss Parker," they replied. William and Kate hugged George goodbye. "We'll pick you up at 3, Kate said. They watched as George walked into his classroom. Then they got back in the car. The royal couple had a full day ahead. Later that afternoon, William and Kate arrived to pick up George. He came running out with a painting in his hand. It showed the palace gardens, but there was something strange about it. "Look what I made," George said proudly. William took the painting. "This is very good, George. But who is this?" He pointed to a figure in the corner of the painting. It was an old man with a beard wearing what looked like a crown. George looked confused. "That's the man who walks in our garden sometimes. Don't you see him?" Kate and William exchanged looks. "What man, darling?" Kate asked gently. "The old man with the shiny crown. He waves to me from outside my window sometimes. He's very nice." William felt a chill run down his back. "George, there is no man with a crown in our garden." "Yes, there is," George insisted. "I see him all the time. He told me his name is George, too." The ride back to the palace was quiet. William and Kate were worried. Who was this person George thought he saw? Was it just a child's imagination? Or was something strange happening? When they arrived home, George ran to his room to put away his school things. William turned to Kate. "We need to talk to security," he said in a low voice. "I want to make sure no one unauthorized is getting into the palace grounds." Kate nodded, but she looked thoughtful. "Do you think it could be something else?" The way he described the man with the crown. William didn't finish her thought. They both knew the royal family had many stories about the past. Some people said old palaces kept memories of those who lived there before. That night, they decided to watch George more carefully. Neither of them could have guessed what would happen next. William sat in the palace library late into the night. Books and papers were spread across the large oak table. He was reading everything he could find about King George V. The old king had been his great-great-grandfather. William had learned about him in history lessons, but he had never paid much attention to the personal details. Now he was finding interesting facts. King George V had loved children. He had been very close to his grandchildren. And most surprising of all, he had died in the very same palace where they now lived. William rubbed his tired eyes. How could George have known what King George V looked like? The boy had described his naval uniform, his beard, and his crown perfectly. It did not make sense. The clock struck midnight. William gathered his books and went upstairs. Kate was still awake, waiting for him in their bedroom. "Did you find anything?" she asked. William nodded. George V died in this palace, and he was known for his love of children and family. Kate looked out the window at the dark garden. "Do you think it's possible that George is actually seeing something?" "I don't know what to think," William admitted, "but tomorrow I want to talk to someone who might know more." The next morning, William called Mrs. Winters. She was 90 years old and had worked in the palace since she was a young girl. Her grandmother had worked for King George V himself. If anyone knew the old stories of the palace, it would be Mrs. Winters. She arrived at 10 o'clock, her white hair neatly pinned up. Despite her age, she stood straight and walked without a cane. "Your Royal Highness," she said with a small bow. "It has been many years." William led her to the private sitting room. George was playing with his toys in the corner. "Mrs. Winters, thank you for coming. I wanted to ask you about King George V." The old woman's eyes lit up. "Ah, a fine king. My grandmother spoke of him often." William explained what George had been seeing. Instead of looking surprised, Mrs. Winters nodded slowly. "There have always been stories," she said. "The old king loved this palace. Before he died, they say he promised to watch over his family for generations to come." She turned to look at young George. "And he had a special love for children named after him. There was a young prince, his grandson, also named George. The king doted on him." "Have others seen him?" William asked. Mrs. Winters smiled. "There have been reports over the years. A figure in the garden. A man in royal naval dress seen near the children's rooms. Always watching, never interfering." George looked up from his toys. "He told me he has to make sure I'm okay, because I will be important someday." Mrs. Winters nodded. The old king was very concerned with duty and the future of the royal family. Later that day, William and Kate took George for a walk in the palace garden. The spring air was warm, and flowers were blooming everywhere. "Can you show us where you usually see him?" Kate asked. George led them to the stone bench under the oak tree. "He sits here sometimes, and sometimes he walks on that path." He pointed to a gravel path that wound through the rose beds. William had a sudden memory. This was King George V's favorite spot in the garden. There are old photographs of him sitting on this very bench. As they stood there, a strange thing happened. A robin landed on the bench. It was unusual because the bird showed no fear. It hopped along the bench and then seemed to look directly at George. "Look," George whispered. He sent his bird to say hello. The robin chirped once, twice, and then flew to George's shoulder. It sat there for a moment before flying away. Kate gasped. "I've never seen a wild bird do that." William stared at the empty bench. For just a second, he thought he saw something. A shimmer in the air, a faint outline of a seated figure. But when he blinked, it was gone. "I think we should learn more about King George V," William said. "And tomorrow, I want to visit a special place." That night, strange things began to happen in the palace. Things that made William wonder if his son really was seeing the ghost of the old king. That night, William woke up at exactly 3 in the morning. The room was cold, much colder than it should be. He could see his breath in the air. Next to him, Kate was still sleeping peacefully. William got up and put on his robe. He had a strange feeling that he should check on George. He walked down the hallway to his son's room. As he approached, he heard voices. Someone was talking softly. He quickened his pace. Who could be in George's room at this hour? He pushed the door open slowly. George was sitting up in his bed. He was talking to an empty chair by the window. William froze in the doorway. "Daddy," George said, turning to him. "Look who came to visit me." William looked at the chair. For a moment, just a brief moment, he thought he saw something. a faint outline of a man sitting there. But then it was gone. "He says he's happy you're learning about him," George said. "He says you were always his favorite." William's heart raced. "What else does he say?" "He says there's a box in the attic, a wooden box with his picture on it. He wants us to find it." William sat on the edge of George's bed. "Did he say what's in the box?" George nodded. "Things he left for us. Things he wants us to have." In the morning, William told Kate about his experience and George's message. They decided to look for the box. The palace attic was huge and full of old trunks and furniture. They would need help. William called Mr. Peters, the palace historian. He knew where everything was stored. They told him they were looking for a wooden box with King George V's picture on it. "I know exactly what you're looking for," Mr. Peters said. "The king's personal effects box. It's been in the attic for decades. No one has opened it since his death." Mr. Peters led them to a far corner of the attic. There, under a dusty sheet, was a large wooden box. It had a small metal plaque with King George V's portrait on the lid. "This has been sealed since 1936, Mr. Peters explained. "According to records, the king asked for it to be given to a future George in the royal family when the time was right." William and Kate looked at each other in amazement. How could George have known about this box? They brought the box down to their private sitting room. George was waiting for them, excited to see what was inside. "He told me there are special things in there," George said. William carefully opened the old box. Inside were several items wrapped in silk cloth. The first was a small naval medal. "This is the king's personal medal from his time in the Navy," Mr. Peters explained. The second item was a pocket watch with the royal seal. The third was a small silver frame with a family photograph. It showed King George V with his children and grandchildren. But the most surprising item was at the bottom of the box. It was a letter in a sealed envelope. On the front was written one word, "George." "It's for me," George said confidently. William handed the envelope to his son. George opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in faded ink. George could not read all the words, so William read it aloud. "To my namesake, I leave these tokens of my life. The medal to remind you of service. The watch to remind you that time is precious. The photograph to remind you that family is everything. I will watch over you until you are ready. When you can see me, the time has come to find these things. Trust in what you see, young George. Not everyone can see what you see." The letter was signed, "Your guardian, George Rye." Everyone in the room was silent. The letter seemed to be written for a future Prince George, who would be able to see the old king's spirit. It was impossible. The letter had been sealed in this box since 1936, long before their George was born. "He's nodding," George said suddenly, looking at the empty space near the window. "He's happy we found it." William felt a chill run down his spine. Something truly extraordinary was happening in their lives, and it was only beginning. News about the strange events at the palace stayed within the family. William and Kate told only William's father, King Charles, about what was happening. At first, Charles did not believe them, but when they showed him the box and the letter, he became very quiet. "There have always been stories in our family," Charles said. "My grandmother once told me she saw her father walking in the garden years after he died. I thought it was just a story." A week after finding the box, William arranged a special visit. They would go to Sandringham House, the country home where King George V had died. If there was a connection between the old king and young George, perhaps they would find more answers there. The royal family traveled to Sandringham on a rainy Saturday morning. The old house was mostly used for Christmas gatherings now. It was quiet and empty the rest of the year. The king died in the blue room, the house manager told them as they arrived. It has been kept much the same since then. George was excited to explore the house. He told me he has another house too. He says we will go there for Christmas. William smiled. Sandringham was indeed where the royal family spent Christmas each year. How did George know this? They walked through the grand halls of Sandringham. George seemed to know his way around, even though he had only been there once as a baby. "His room is this way," George said, leading them down a corridor. The house manager looked surprised. "The young prince is right. King George V's bedroom is indeed down that hall." They followed George to a large room with blue wallpaper. This was where the old king had spent his final days. The bed was still there, along with his personal desk and bookshelves. George walked straight to a painting on the wall. It showed a naval ship at sea. He says this was his favorite ship. He was the captain. The house manager nodded in surprise. "That's correct. That painting shows HMS Bakshant. The king served on her as a young prince." Kate took William's hand. This was beyond coincidence. George was somehow connected to the old king in a way they could not explain. While they were in the blue room, something strange happened. The temperature dropped suddenly. The lights flickered. And for a brief moment, everyone in the room felt a presence. "He's here," George said simply. The house manager, who had been skeptical, turned pale. I felt something too. Even Charles looked shaken. There was definitely something just now. They spent the rest of the day exploring Sandringham. George led them to places that had been special to King George V. The garden where he used to walk, the study where he worked, the small chapel where he prayed. In the chapel, George stopped in front of a stained glass window. It showed St. George slaying the dragon. "He says, this is why he chose my name," George said, "because St. George was brave." William knew this was true. King George V had changed the family name to Windsor and had chosen to use his middle name, George, as king. He had often spoken about St. George as a symbol of courage. Before they left Sandringham, George asked to go back to the blue room one more time. When they got there, he walked to a specific floorboard near the window. "There's something under here," he said. The house manager looked confused. "That's impossible. This floor hasn't been touched in decades." But William trusted his son. He asked for tools, and they carefully lifted the floorboard. Underneath was a small metal box. Inside was a child's toy soldier, painted in a naval uniform. "That's him when he was young," George said, pointing to the toy. Charles examined the toy carefully. "This is incredible. This is a custom-made toy from the 1870s. It would have been made when George V was a boy." They replaced the floorboard and took the toy with them. On the drive back to London, George fell asleep holding the toy soldier. William and Kate spoke in whispers. "What do we do about this?" Kate asked. William looked at his sleeping son. "I think we accept it. George V seems to be watching over him, teaching him. There must be a reason." That night, back at the palace, William had a dream. In the dream, he saw King George V standing by George's bed. The old king looked at William and nodded. Then he said something that William would remember when he woke up. "The past watches over the future. Some bonds never break." The next morning at breakfast, George had news for his parents. "He wants me to go to the Tower of London," he announced. "He says there's something important there." William and Kate exchanged glances. The Tower of London held the crown jewels and was an important historical site, but it was also very public. A royal visit would draw attention. "We could make it a private tour," William suggested, before opening hours. They arranged for a special visit the following day. The tower would open just for them at 6 in the morning, before any tourists arrived. When they arrived at the tower, they were met by the chief yeoman warder, Mr. Blackwood. He wore the traditional uniform of the Tower Guards, known as beefeaters. "Welcome, your royal highnesses," he said with a bow. "It is an honor to give you a private tour." George looked around with wide eyes. "Where are the ravens?" he asked. Mr. Blackwood smiled. "They're in their cages until morning." "How did you know about the ravens?" "He told me," George said. "He says the kingdom will fall if they leave." Mr. Blackwood looked surprised. This was an old legend about the Tower Ravens. If they ever left the tower, the kingdom would fall. It was not something most children would know. They began their tour. Mr. Blackwood expected to lead the way, but George seemed to know where he wanted to go. "This way," George said, walking confidently through the ancient halls. He led them to the White Tower, the oldest part of the fortress. Inside, they climbed the stairs to the upper floors. George stopped outside a specific room. "In here," he said. Mr. Blackwood unlocked the door. Inside was a display of royal armor from different periods of history. George walked straight to a small suit of armor made for a child. "This was his," George said, "when he was my age." Mr. Blackwood checked the information card next to the armor. This belonged to Prince George of Wales, later King George V. It was made for him when he was 7 years old. He looked at George with amazement. "How did you know that?" George shrugged. "He showed me a picture of him wearing it." After looking at the armor, George led them to the crown jewels. This was the main attraction of the tower, where the royal crowns, scepters, and other treasures were kept. As they entered the vault, the lights seemed to flicker slightly. George walked directly to the imperial state crown, the crown used by monarchs at state openings of Parliament. "That's his crown," George said. "He wore it for important meetings." William nodded. "That's right. King George V would have worn this crown many times." As they stood looking at the crown, something remarkable happened. One of the large diamonds in the crown seemed to glow for a moment. It shone with an unusual brightness, as if catching a ray of sunlight, but they were underground, and there was no sunlight. "He's here," George whispered. Mr. Blackwood, who had worked at the tower for 30 years, looked stunned. "I've never seen anything like that before." After viewing the crown jewels, George wanted to see one more place. He led them to the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower grounds. This small chapel contained the graves of many historical figures. Inside the chapel, George walked to a memorial on the wall. It listed the names of important people connected to the tower. One of the names was King George V, who had visited the tower many times during his reign. "He says this place is important to remember," George said. "Bad things happened here, but we should not forget them." William was impressed by his son's understanding. The tower had indeed been a place of imprisonment and execution in the past. It was part of royal history that was not always pleasant to remember. As they were leaving the tower, one of the ravens had been released from its cage. It flew directly to George and landed near his feet. It made a croaking sound and hopped around him in circles. "The ravens never approach visitors like that," Mr. Blackwood said in amazement. George smiled. "He says the ravens remember him. They are the guardians of the kingdom." On the drive back to the palace, William asked George what else King George V had told him about the tower. "He says it's where kings and queens learn about duty," George replied. "He had to learn hard lessons there. He wants me to understand what it means to be royal." William nodded thoughtfully. King George V had been known for his strong sense of duty and tradition. He had guided the monarchy through difficult times, including World War I and major political changes. "Did he say why he's appearing to you now?" Kate asked gently. George looked out the car window. "He says there are things I need to know. Things only he can teach me. He says it's almost time for something important." That evening, after George was in bed, William and Kate discussed the day's events. "It's getting harder to deny that something extraordinary is happening," William said. Kate nodded. "The question is, what does it mean? Why is King George V reaching out to our son from beyond?" They did not know that the answer would come sooner than they expected, and it would change everything they thought they knew about their son's future. A week after their visit to the Tower of London, the royal family received unexpected news. King Charles needed a serious medical operation. It was nothing life-threatening, but he would need several months to recover. During this time, William would need to take on more royal duties as the heir to the throne. This meant that George would also have more public attention. As the future king after his father, he would be watched more closely by the press and the public. William and Kate sat George down to explain the situation. "Your grandfather needs to rest and get better," William said. "So Daddy will be doing more of the king's work for a while. And that means you might have to come to some important events too." George nodded seriously. "I know. He told me this would happen." William raised his eyebrows. "King George V told you about grandfather's health?" "Yes. He said grandfather would be okay. But you would need to step up. And I would need to be ready too." Kate and William were amazed. How could the spirit of King George V have known about Charles's health issues before they happened? That night, George had a special visitor in his dreams. King George V appeared to him more clearly than ever before. "The time is coming, young George," the old king said. "Soon you will need to show everyone what you have learned." The next morning, George told his parents about the dream. "He showed me a big room with gold chairs. He said we would go there soon for an important event." William immediately knew what room George was describing. It was the throne room at Buckingham Palace, used for official state functions. But there were no events planned there in the near future. 3 days later, William received a call from the Prime Minister. Due to King Charles's recovery, they wanted to hold a special Privy Council meeting. This was a formal meeting of the king's advisors. Since Charles could not attend, William would represent him. And they wanted to hold it in the throne room at Buckingham Palace. How did George know about this? Kate asked when William told her the news. William shook his head. "I don't know. But the Prime Minister has asked if George can attend too. They want to show the continuity of the monarchy. 3 generations." On the day of the Privy Council meeting, George was dressed in his best suit. As they entered Buckingham Palace, he did not need anyone to show him the way. He walked confidently through the grand halls to the throne room. The throne room was just as George had described from his dream. Gold chairs were arranged in rows. The royal throne sat on a platform at the front of the room. As the meeting was about to begin, George tugged on William's sleeve. "He's here too," he whispered, nodding toward the throne. William couldn't see anything, but he felt a strange sense of presence in the room. Many of the officials commented later that there was something special about the atmosphere that day. The meeting went perfectly. George sat quietly beside his father. When introduced to the officials, he was polite and composed. Several people remarked on how mature he seemed for his age. "He's a true Windsor," one old minister said. "Reminds me of pictures I've seen of King George V as a boy." After the meeting, as they were leaving the palace, something unusual happened. An elderly gentleman approached them. He was very old, at least 90, and walked with a cane. "Excuse me, Your Royal Highness," he said to William. "I hope you don't mind me speaking, but I had to meet the young prince." William smiled politely. "Of course." The old man looked at George with tears in his eyes. "My grandfather was a footman for King George V. He always told me that the king had a special connection to the future, that he would watch over his descendants." George stepped forward. "What was your grandfather's name?" The old man looked surprised. "Thomas. Thomas Edwards." George smiled. "He had red hair, and he saved the king's dog from drowning in the lake." The old man's face went white. "How could you possibly know that?" "It's true, but it's not in any books. It was a private story in our family." "The king told me," George said simply. Later, William asked the palace researchers to look into the story. They found records of a footman named Thomas Edwards who had worked for King George V, and in a private diary of one of the king's other servants, there was indeed a story about Edwards saving the king's favorite dog from the lake at Sandringham. That evening, the royal family had dinner with King Charles, who was recovering at home. They told him about the day's events and the strange encounter with the old man. Charles listened thoughtfully. "When I was George's age, my grandmother, the Queen Mother, told me something. She said that every generation of our family has one member who is specially connected to those who came before, a keeper of royal memory, she called it. William looked at his son with new understanding. And you think George is that person in our generation? Charles nodded. It would appear so. And how fitting that he connects with King George V, whose name he bears. On the drive home, George looked out at the darkening London streets. He says there's one more place we need to visit, he told his parents. The most important place of all. Where is that? Kate asked. Westminster Abbey, George replied. He says that's where it all begins and ends. William and Kate knew that Westminster Abbey was where British monarchs were crowned. It was also where many were buried. It was indeed the beginning and end of a monarch's reign. Why do we need to go there? William asked. George's answer made them both silent with wonder. Because, he said, that's where I will see him for the last time. He has something very important to give me before he goes. The visit to Westminster Abbey was arranged for early Sunday morning before regular services. The Dean of Westminster, Dr. Harris, would give them a private tour. Only a few staff would be present. During the drive to the Abbey, George was unusually quiet. He held the toy soldier they had found at Sandringham. When they arrived, the grand building loomed against the morning sky. This place is over 1,000 years old, William told George as they approached the entrance. Almost every king and queen has been crowned here. George nodded. I know. He showed me his coronation. There were thousands of people, and he was nervous but didn't show it. Inside, Dr. Harris greeted them warmly. It's an honor to have you visit, Your Royal Highnesses. Where would you like to begin? Before William or Kate could answer, George spoke up. The coronation chair, please. Dr. Harris looked surprised, but led them to the ancient wooden chair that had been used in coronation ceremonies for centuries. It sat in a special area, protected by barriers. This chair was made in 1300, Dr. Harris explained. Every monarch since then has been crowned while sitting in it. George stared at the chair intently. He sat there, he said quietly. And someday, Father will sit there. And then someday, I will too. Dr. Harris was taken aback by the young prince's understanding of his future role. William placed a hand on George's shoulder, feeling a mixture of pride and concern. The weight of royal destiny was heavy, especially for one so young. Next, George asked to see the royal tombs. Dr. Harris led them to an area where many kings and queens were buried. George walked straight to a specific tomb. King George V is here, he said. Dr. Harris nodded, impressed. That's right. He was buried here in 1936. As they stood by the tomb, George became very still. He seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the toy soldier. He wants me to leave this here, George said. He says it's time to give it back. William nodded. Dr. Harris, though confused, gave permission. George carefully placed the toy soldier on the edge of the tomb. As soon as he did, something remarkable happened. A beam of sunlight came through one of the high windows. It fell directly on the toy, making the tiny naval uniform gleam. That's extraordinary, Dr. Harris whispered. That window doesn't usually get direct sunlight at this time of day. George smiled. He says thank you. He says the soldier can rest now, just like him. After visiting the tomb, George led them to another part of the abbey. It was the small chapel of St. George, named for the patron saint of England. Inside the chapel was a beautiful stained glass window showing St. George slaying the dragon. Below it was a small altar with candles. This is where he wants me to wait, George said. Alone, please. William and Kate exchanged concerned glances. We'll be right outside, William said after a moment. They stepped outside the chapel with Dr. Harris, leaving George alone inside. Through the half-open door, they could see him standing before the altar. He seemed to be talking to someone. After a few minutes, they heard George call out, "You can come in now." When they entered the chapel, George was standing very straight, like a little soldier. His face was serious but calm. "What happened?" Kate asked gently. "He said goodbye," George replied. "He said his work is done. I know what I need to know now." "And what is that?" William asked. George looked up at his father with eyes that seemed older than his years. How to be a good king someday. How to be brave and put duty first. How to remember the past while looking to the future. As they were preparing to leave the Abbey, Dr. Harris asked George if he had enjoyed his visit. "Yes," George said, "and I learned something important today." "What was that?" Dr. Harris asked kindly. "That being royal isn't just about crowns and palaces. It's about service and sacrifice. That's what he wanted me to understand." Dr. Harris looked at William and Kate. "He's a remarkable boy." On the way home, George fell asleep in the car. William and Kate talked quietly. "Do you think it's over now?" Kate asked. "These visits from King George V." William looked at his sleeping son. "I think so. It feels like a chapter has closed. But I think George will always carry what he learned." That evening, George drew a picture. It showed a man in a naval uniform standing next to a boy. Between them was a crown. Below the picture, George wrote in his childish handwriting, "The past and the future together." William hung the picture in his study. Whenever important visitors came, they would ask about it. William would simply say it was a drawing his son had made about royal duty. Only the family knew the true story behind the picture. The story of a king who reached across time to guide his namesake. The story of a young prince who was given a unique understanding of his heritage and his future. As George grew older, he never forgot those special months when he could see and speak with King George V. The memory remained clear, guiding him as he prepared for his future role. And sometimes, in the garden at Kensington Palace, the staff would see him pause by the old oak tree. He would smile at the empty bench, give a small nod of respect, and continue on his way. 10 years passed. Prince George was now 17. He had grown into a thoughtful young man who took his royal duties seriously. The strange events of his childhood, when he could see and speak with King George V, had faded into memory. Sometimes he wondered if it had all been the imagination of a 7-year-old boy. On a spring morning, George was preparing for an important day. It would be his first solo royal engagement. He would open a new children's hospital wing named in his honor. His parents would not be with him. This was a milestone in his royal life. As he got dressed in his formal suit, he felt nervous. What if he made a mistake? What if he forgot what to say? There was a knock at his door. It was his father, William, now Prince of Wales after Charles became king. "Ready for the big day?" William asked. George nodded. "I think so. Just a bit nervous." William smiled. "That's normal. I was nervous at my first solo engagement too." He handed George a small box. "I thought you might want to wear this today." George opened the box. Inside was a small pin in the shape of a naval crown. It looked very old. "What is this?" George asked. "It belonged to King George V," William explained. "It was in that box we found when you were 7. I thought today would be a good day for you to wear it." George pinned it to his lapel. As he did, memories from 10 years ago came flooding back. The spirit in the garden, the visits to the Tower and Westminster Abbey, the lessons about duty and service. "Do you ever think about those days?" George asked his father. "When I could see him?" William nodded. "Often. It was extraordinary. But I'd never been sure if he appeared to you because you needed guidance, or because someday the monarchy would need you to have that guidance." They drove to the hospital together, but William would not be part of the ceremony. This was George's moment. As George stepped out of the car alone, crowds of people cheered. Cameras flashed. He took a deep breath and walked toward the hospital entrance where officials waited. Just before he reached them, something made him turn his head. There at the edge of the crowd was an old man in a naval uniform. He stood perfectly straight, his white beard neatly trimmed. On his head was a small crown. George froze. After all these years, was he seeing King George V again? The old man smiled and gave a small nod. Then he raised his hand to his heart and bowed slightly. A camera flashed, momentarily blinding George. When his vision cleared, the man was gone. George continued to the entrance, his heart racing. Had he imagined it? Was his nervous mind playing tricks? The ceremony went perfectly. George gave his speech clearly and confidently. He cut the ribbon and toured the new children's wing, speaking kindly to the young patients. Everyone commented on how natural and composed he seemed. After the event, as he was leaving, a very old woman approached him. She was a hospital volunteer, at least 90 years old. "Excuse me, Your Royal Highness," she said. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you remind me so much of our late king." "Which king?" George asked. "King George V," she replied. "I was just a girl, but I saw him once at a hospital opening much like this one. You have the same way about you, dignified but kind." George thanked her and continued to his car. Inside, he took out his phone and searched for pictures of King George V at public events. In many photos, the king was standing exactly as George had stood today. The same posture, the same hand position, even the same slight smile. George had never studied these photos, yet somehow he had naturally adopted the same royal bearing. When he returned to the palace, he went to his father's study. The childhood drawing of the man and boy with the crown still hung on the wall. "I saw him today," George told William. "Just for a moment, outside the hospital." William looked up from his papers. "After all these years?" George nodded. "I think he came to see me take my first solo step as a royal. And I met a woman who said I reminded her of him." He touched the naval crown pin on his lapel. "I don't think it was just imagination when I was a boy. I think he really did come to teach me, and I think parts of him stay with me, even now." That night, George had a vivid dream. He was walking in the gardens at Kensington Palace. King George V was walking beside him. "You did well today," the king said. "Thank you," George replied. "Will I see you again?" The old king smiled. "Not in the same way. You're grown now. You have your own path to follow. But remember what I taught you." "About duty and service," George said. "Yes, and about family. The crown passes from head to head, but what matters is the unbroken chain of dedication. That's what keeps the monarchy strong." When George woke, he felt a sense of peace. He got up and went to his desk. He took out a pen and paper and began to write. It was a letter to his future self, to be opened when he became king. "Remember the lessons of King George V," he wrote. "Remember that you are part of something larger than yourself, a chain that stretches back through time and forward into the future." As he wrote, the early morning sun came through his window. It fell on the naval crown pin he had placed on his desk. For a moment, the pin seemed to glow with an inner light. George smiled. Some connections, he knew now, could never be broken, not even by time or death. The past would always be there to guide the future if only one knew how to see it. Outside in the garden, under the old oak tree, a robin landed on the stone bench. It sang a brief, beautiful song, then flew away into the brightening sky.